Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating concept called the theory of demographic transition, and we're going to map it directly onto India's historical data. If you've ever wondered how societies grow, stabilize, and transform economically as their populations change, you are in exactly the right place. We're going to look at how health, economics, and human behavior all come together to shape the future of a nation. Here's our quick roadmap for today. We'll cover the basics of population, the demographic transition theory, stages 1, 2, and 3, and finally, India's demographic future. All right, part 1, the basics of population, essential vocabulary. Let's get right into it by establishing the basic metrics we need, because you really can't track a country's life cycle without understanding the underlying math of its people. First up, we have the birth rate. Simply put, this is the number of births occurring per 1,000 people in a single year. You might also hear this called the fertility rate. It's the metric that tells us how fast a society is adding new lives. On the flip side of that equation, we've got the death rate or mortality rate. Same idea here. It measures the number of deaths per 1,000 people annually. These two numbers are absolutely foundational. Now here is where it gets really interesting, the survival rate. This is just the difference between the birth rate and the death rate. When you subtract the deaths from the births, you get the actual rate of natural population growth. It's this exact margin that dictates whether a population shrinks, explodes, or just perfectly balances out. Section 2. Demographic Transition Theory, the life cycle of a nation. With those terms out of the way, let's look at the core theory that explains how these rates actually behave as a country develops. This theory was introduced by A.J. Cole and E.M. Hoover back in 1958 in their book Population Growth and Economic Development in Low-Income Countries. What they did was super insightful. They showed that there's a real structural relationship between a country's economic development and its population growth. It explains how and why a country transitions from high birth and death rates to low ones. According to their theory, as a country advances economically, its population invariably passes through these three distinct stages. It starts in the first stage with low growth, rockets into a second stage of high growth, and then finally settles into a third stage of low or stable population. Let's break down exactly what happens in each one. Section 3. Stage 1. Pre-industrial, low growth of population. To picture this, think of a totally pre-industrialized, primitive stage. All underdeveloped countries have passed through this. For India, this was the reality before 1921. Interestingly, population growth actually stays very low here. But why? Well, it's because both the birth rate and the death rate are incredibly high. Social and economic conditions like mass illiteracy, superstitions, poverty, orthodoxy, a total lack of medical facilities, and the unchecked spread of epidemics basically cancel out the high birth rate. It's a pretty harsh equilibrium. Section 4, Stage 2, Population Explosion, high growth of population. This kicks in when a country starts industrializing and taking its first steps toward economic development. This stage is defined by a huge disconnect. Thanks to economic development, you start seeing rapid improvements in medical facilities, disaster management, and nutrition. Because of this, the death rate starts falling rapidly. The brakes are off. But the birth rate continues to remain high due to ingrained things like illiteracy, early marriage ages, and joint family systems. When your death rate plummets but your birth rate stays high, you get a population explosion. Basically, the growth of the population ends up being much faster than the growth and development of the economy itself. All developing countries, including India, are in this second stage. Take a look at this real quick. It's a pretty striking visual metaphor for that exact explosion in India. On the left, we've got a relatively empty Jeep representing 1961. Fast forward to 2011 on the right, and that exact same vehicle is dangerously overcrowded. It perfectly illustrates what happens when population growth vastly outpaces infrastructure. On to Section 5, Stage 3, Stable Population, the final transition. Eventually, things do settle down. In this third stage, society transforms. Rapid industrialization and urbanization really take hold. Education spreads, and with that comes a new consciousness about the standard of living. Raising a family in a city is expensive, and as the economy develops, both the birth rate and the death rate tend to decline and balance out. The population stabilizes. And just so you know, all developed countries are in this stage right now. Section 6. India's demographic future. The map to reality. So how does India's historical data map onto Colin Hoover's theory? Let's look at the hard numbers. In 1901, deep in stage 1, the rates were nearly tied at around 49 births and 42 deaths per thousand. By 1951, India hit stage 2. Look at that death rate. It nearly halved to 22.8, but births stubbornly stayed high at 41.7. Then by 2011, the death rate plummeted down to a highly developed 7.48, while the birth rate was finally dropping, but still lagging behind at nearly 21. This graph tells the story of stage 2 perfectly. See that massive gap in the middle between the rapidly falling blue death rate line and the slow to decline pink birth rate line? That giant space is the survival rate we talked about earlier. It visually proves how India's modern population explosion happened. We're looking at hundreds of millions of people being added right there in the middle. But the trend is shifting. The data shows us that after decades of this population explosion, India is currently right on the verge of entering the third stage of demographic transition. The pink line is finally coming down to meet the blue line. And as it hits this transition, India gets to unlock something called a demographic dividend. This happens when the proportion of working-age people to the total population is really high. Thanks to the previous population boom, India now has an absolute powerhouse of human resources, which indicates a massive potential to contribute to future economic growth. Which leaves us with this one big question. As India firmly stabilizes its population and moves into stage 3, will this demographic dividend become its ultimate competitive advantage? It's all about transforming that sheer volume of human capital into real economic dominance, and it's going to be incredibly exciting to watch. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do.